Welcome, everyone. This is great to see the numbers climbing as folks are joining this webinar that we'll have right now. I'll just take this moment to get us started and to welcome you all to what's going to be an incredibly meaty conversation here as we get underway. I am delighted to open up this webinar. I'm Sheena Ashley. I serve as a vice president at the Urban Institute, where I have the privilege of leading the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy, and also Urban's Racial Equity Analytics Lab. And it is through that experience of both working so long and leading alongside others with nonprofit data that it is the value and the key asset that this new data resource provides for us in the field of nonprofit research. I'd just like to speak very briefly to how incredibly important having this new nationally representative longitudinal data source is. It is transformative for nonprofit research to have finally, this is almost, it's been a decade in building, but we are finally here where there are data, and it was accomplished through a global pandemic that we still receive the response and participation from so many nonprofit leaders in responding to this survey. And so definitely want to acknowledge just the goodwill and participation of so many leaders in the field who also understood the importance of us having this incredibly rich new data resource to have available, to take the time to participate in this. Also want to acknowledge and thank the partners who came together to make this happen. So much great intellectual work that came together to build this, all the reviewers to make sure that we were asking the right questions to get to the information the sector needs to have into this. And also to thank the funders who took the opportunity. Thank you to the Generosity Commission and also the National Science Foundation for really investing in this core data infrastructure that we need to be able to understand where the sector has been and also where it's going as we continue to deliver this survey on an annual basis. I think the real value that we see from this is not just in all the effort that it took to get to where we are now, but it's at this point where people get to use the results from these data to make decisions. And I am so glad to be joined on this occasion today with leaders in the field from different dimensions, grant making, folks who lead associations of nonprofits, and all parts of our infrastructure who can talk more about the uses of this data and how it can inform decision-making right now to change some of what we have seen in terms of the trends that we have witnessed through the data that we've collected. So let me take a moment to just introduce the voices that you will hear through this webinar. Louis Falk will be up first. He's an associate professor of public administration and policy in the School of Public Affairs at American University, and he will present the findings from this study. And then we'll have a fabulous panel that will be moderated by Allison Grayson, who is always a pleasure to hear and to get her perspective on this work. And she will be in conversation with Dara Johnson from the Horning Family Foundation, Kelly Kuhn from the Michigan Nonprofit Association. Thank you so much, Kelly, for all the great work you all do in the Michigan Nonprofit Association. And also from Sunil Iyengar, who is joining us from the National Endowment for the Arts, where he leads research and data partnerships. So it'll be really great to hear more about the interconnections between the research and data that we have from this study and the rich data assets that we have available across the sector as well. With that, I want to make sure that folks feel welcome. We are recording this webinar, and so the resources will be available as we continue to go out, but feel free to make sure that you include questions throughout in the chat if anything comes up as you are listening to the discussion, and there will be time for engagement at the end of the presentations. So with that, I will pass it over to Louis Falk to get us into the data. It's all what we're here to hear about. And so without further ado, we will jump in to listen to some of those findings.
Thank you so much, Sheena, and welcome everybody. Thank you to the School of Public Affairs and the the media team for helping us put this together, as well as everyone who could join us today. I will share my screen. And as I pull this up, if you could please make sure that you use the Q&A function to be able to post any of your questions. I can respond to any questions in the Q&A during the rest of the event as well. I want to focus a lot of our discussion with the insights from the panelists who we are fortunate to have with us today. With that, as Sheena mentioned, right, these are findings from our first year of a longitudinal panel. So the real value here is not just in these first year findings that give us a representative snapshot of nonprofits across the United States, and as well as trends in donations to nonprofits and their experiences in 2020. Really, the longer term value is that this is a baseline study that will provide some key findings that we can add to each year when we repeat this survey to these organizations and learn more over time. I'd like to acknowledge the other authors on this report that's posted at the Urban Institute. When you see these Scan Me QR codes, you can use your phone to scan those, and that will just bring you to the link that's posted on the screen. I do want to acknowledge our funders and thank our funders. As Sheena mentioned, the Generosity Commission was a huge catalyst for this study, being able to fund this first year survey. And we can't thank that funder and the Giving USA enough. Also, the National Science Foundation has generously funded a 3-year project among collaborators on this project, including Urban Institute, AU, George Mason University, and Georgia Institute for Technology. And that broader project is developing the infrastructure to share the data, develop data processes, and also to streamline survey research and science on the nonprofit sector. And then also thanking the independent sector, in part through the independent sector's Visiting Scholars Program and other in-kind support. There are a few key outcomes that we're really excited about with this study. As I mentioned, it's the first nationally representative survey that's going to be a baseline for longitudinal surveys over time. We are producing these data and sharing them publicly. There are a lot of questions in the survey that we're not reporting on here, but we encourage everyone to dive into the data to be able to evaluate and analyze other questions of interest. And then this is the foundation for collaborative infrastructure for broader research, more rigorous research, more representative research, and more timely research on the nonprofit sector and the communities the nonprofit sector serves. Our first year was really targeting a certain set of research questions in addition to gathering baseline data across a number of dimensions. One of our primary research questions was understanding donation trends and how those donation trends have affected nonprofits across the United States, and particularly across different income community categories, such as income and majority person of color communities, as well as other types of attributes of nonprofits, such as organizations across size categories and subsectors. We launched the survey in January 2021, so with some pre-testing in December 2020. And then we asked organizations to respond based on their 2020 experiences in 2020 calendar year. We targeted organizations that are over $50,000 in annual revenue and expenses, in part because we want to be able to combine these data with the 990 data, so publicly available data from the IRS on these organizations which file these reports annually with the IRS. And then we're looking at these questions across organization categories as well as community characteristics, as mentioned. So one of the community characteristics that we're focused on here is communities by income level. And this is based on a ratio of median household income in a zip code relative to state median household income. And as you can see, across the United States, we have quite a few communities in the US that are categorized in this most severely low income category, which would be the number 4 on the legend there, or the darkest color. So we're really interested in how these organizations that are located in these lowest income areas and communities are affected or have been affected by donation trends as well as the pandemic. And then our second geographic focus is looking at urban versus rural versus suburban areas across the country, which we've defined these more in detail in our methodology in the full report. But just so you have an idea here, the urban core is really thinking about these largest cities across the US and the core zip codes or areas within those largest cities, with suburban being smaller population areas that are still suburban or partly urban, and then rural areas, which are defined as a population that's in that zip code, which is defined as rural. One challenge that we face as nonprofit researchers is that a lot of the information we have on where nonprofits are located come from the forms they file with the IRS. And in general, this is a mailing address, right? And many of these addresses on the IRS forms are filled out as PO boxes. So it's hard to understand where organizations are actually providing services. So one question of interest for this entire panel and for this data collection initiative was to understand where nonprofits are providing services and to whom they're providing services. So not just understanding where they might have a mailing address, but where they're actually providing services, up to 6 service locations, and then being able to code those by geographic areas. In terms of the organizations that we sampled across the United States in a representative sample of nonprofits above $50,000 in annual expenses. But we excluded certain categories of organizations like hospitals and higher education to really focus on organizations that are operating organizations that are receiving donations to provide services. As you can see here, we have 2,306 usable responses from the survey, and this is representative across many categories. There was not a response bias that we could determine based on key attributes that we were sampling on, including organization size and subsector. And then we're using the weighted responses, so these are fully representative of the population we surveyed. I want to jump into our key findings, and really with the understanding that this is just scratching the surface, right? And this is, again, a snapshot of 2020. So we're looking forward to understanding how these trends and characteristics of organizations evolve in our next year survey, which will be launched in the spring, as well as future surveys. But for our first year findings in this representative sample, we're seeing that nonprofits really are serving a diverse communities across the United States. So this is shown both in the distribution of organizations across urban, suburban, and rural, but also across low income and high income areas across the US, with the majority of nonprofits being located and providing services in lower income communities. So communities that are below the state median income level. Nonprofits are also serving a wide range of people, both in terms of the general public, but also in terms of specific categories or groups of individuals who identify in different marginalized groups or other groups that nonprofits focus on. With 45% of organizations having programs that do focus on individuals below the federal poverty line, and then a large number of organizations that have additional programs focused on specific marginalized groups. We also see that nonprofit leadership, when we compare our findings to previous surveys that are representative of the same set of nonprofits across the US, so including Urban Institute's reports from 2005 to 2006, we find that nonprofit leadership overall is becoming more diverse, right? So 70% of boards have at least one person of color, 50% of board members on average are women, and 21% of executive directors are people of color, as well as 62% of executive directors being identifying as female. However, there are challenges that remain. 16% of nonprofits that are primarily serving people of color have all white boards. And this is similar to Francie Ostrauer's findings from an Urban Institute report in the early 2000s. And then 58% of rural nonprofits have no board members of color, compared to 15% of urban core nonprofits and 31% of suburban nonprofits. Other findings we were interested in, like I mentioned at the top, right, were on donation trends and how nonprofits were being affected by donation trends, both over the last 5 years before 2020, but also during the pandemic. One key finding that we've noted here is that donations from individuals, so this is not just foundations or other types of donations, but donations coming from individuals are essential to nonprofits, with 73% of organizations viewing donations from individuals as very important or essential to their work. And this is especially true for organizations that are the smallest category of organization. So less than $100,000 in annual expenses depend much more heavily compared to larger organizations. And organizations less than $500,000 in annual expenses are also important here because they make up more than 60% of the sector, but they also report in a separate area of the study that roughly 30% of their revenue comes from individual donations, compared to a much smaller proportion of total revenue for larger organizations. In terms of donation trends, we see that in the 5 years preceding 2020, there was a general trend in the sector towards donation growth, or organizations that were experiencing growth in the donations coming into their nonprofits. And this is a trend that we noted in the open-ended responses from organizations that several mentioned how their organization in this time period was still climbing out of the recession. And so there was a general upward trend that we noticed. However, there is a certain set of organizations, so around 10 to 11% of organizations that still were experiencing decreases or declines in donations before the 2020 period. That proportion of the sector that experienced declines in donations jumped dramatically in 2020, so in the early period of the pandemic and economic uncertainty, where you can see this dramatic rise in the black and the red columns, or parts of the bars where you have dramatic increases in 2020 in the organizations that experienced declines. Again, for smaller organizations, they were relatively harder hit by this trend, with 42% of those organizations experiencing declines during 2020, compared to 29% of larger organizations. We also saw other disparities in trends in these longer term trends for organizations. And one striking finding was that organizations that were led by people of color, so executive directors or CEOs of color, experienced a greater proportion of those organizations experienced overall declines in donations in 2015 to 2019, and fewer of those organizations led by people of color experienced increases in 2015 to 2019. So there was already a concerning trend or disparity in the trends that we're noticing in the 2015 to 2019 period relative to donations to organizations. We saw other divides as well. One important divide that we noted is that that rural and urban organizations appear to have or experience somewhat different trends. In the 2015 to 2019 period, fewer organizations in rural areas as a proportion to total organizations experienced increases in donations during that trend. And in 2020, fewer organizations in rural areas experienced dramatic changes as well compared to urban organizations, which tended to have their trends reversed dramatically or more dramatically than rural areas. We know that there were other important issues taking place during 2020, and with the pandemic-related effects, especially with social distancing measures and other stay-at-home orders, we know that organizations, especially in the arts and other fields that depend on in-person services, had dramatic impacts or hits on their in-person services and activities. This also was reflected in their fees for service, which much of the sector does depend on fees from ticket sales and other types of services they're directly providing to individuals, even if they're subsidized. And we see that there was a dramatic decline in the median amount of fees for service that organizations were collecting in 2020 when we compare that to the prior year in 2019. We also see that organizations that are smaller tend to be more heavily hit by a decline in fees for service. And then we also see that this trend particularly hit organizations like organizations in the arts, which do tend to depend more heavily on these in-person experiences and activities to be able to provide their mission and serve the individuals they're serving, which is related to some of their revenue that's coming in from those in-person activities. When we look at human resources, one important finding here is that we didn't see a dramatic decline or drop off in full-time staff in 2020. However, when we look deeper and scratch below that surface, we do see greater impacts, especially with part-time staff in rural areas, and then with regular and episodic volunteers, where we're seeing dramatic declines during 2020. There remains a question on how this is recovered in 2021 and how it will recover in the years moving forward. And that's one thing that I'd love to get some insights from our panel on some of these trends and how they compare to what we're experiencing today. We do, however, know that during 2020, that organizations were not only particularly hard hit by donation declines and other fees for service and other revenue, they also responded by decreasing their overall expenses, so pulling back, drawing on reserves, in addition to a range of other kinds of outcomes that they, or responses that they conducted. But these were pretty striking in terms of the percentage of organizations that did report decreasing their overall expenses. It's important to note here that around 2/3 of organizations applied for a PPP loan, and virtually all of those organizations received the loans that they applied for. But that leaves a good third of organizations that did not have access to that funding source from the federal government, in part because many of those organizations are volunteer run. But it opens the door to other questions that we're interested in understanding better, especially as organizations recover from 2020 in terms of support they're receiving, not only from government, but from other sources as well. And we see these other impacts from 2020 where organizations, we know that this is a reality that organizations were forced to pause their services at least, but this also translated into a reduced number of people served by the end of year and the reduced number of programs that they were able to provide. With that, I want to thank you. And I'd really like to preserve a lot of time for our conversation with our panelists and insights that they have from their own work. You can use these QR codes to access these other links that we're able to provide, and I can put these links also in the chat so you can access those directly. With that, I'll turn it over to Allison Grayson from Independent Sector, who will lead or moderate our panel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Louis. I know that the data technically scratches the surface, but there's a lot to chew on, even on what you just presented. So I'm glad we get to have a conversation about this. One of the things I want to kind of comment on as we get started is Sheena mentioned initially, part of this is about understanding what's happening in the sector, both last year and now evaluating how that might be changing going forward. But the reason that's so important is so that we can make decisions and take action on that information. And Independent Sector, we put out a report called the Sector Health Report. Some of it compiles this data, but the other piece of it is to recommend action. One of the challenges we experienced in 2020 is there wasn't a lot of real-time data then to help us understand what was happening in the sector, what were the needs, And we knew that policymakers, donors, and foundations were looking for that information to figure out how to be responsive. So it's really exciting to see this data and to know that there are subsequent surveys that are coming out that'll help us sort of understand how the sector is responding and sort of recovering or not as the global pandemic and economic crisis continues. One of the things that we also recognize, though, is although we're greatly enthusiastic about this nationally representative sample because it helps us feel more confident in decisions we make, is we also know that it doesn't, national numbers on nonprofits, because our sector is so diverse, doesn't necessarily apply to every nonprofit or individual organization's experiences, which is why we want to have a conversation with experts on the panel today about what aspects of this data resonate or align with what you observed in your network in the last year and the recovery they're seeing this year, and what parts differed, so we can get a better understanding of the nuance associated with this national level data. So with that, let's get the conversation going, and I'd love to start with Dara. Dara, I'm going to turn it over to you for your thoughts and reflections.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the partners who've had a hand in this, the research study. A lot of the data that has been presented for 2020 is in line, even though it's a national focus, it is in line in what we were seeing locally in DC. So I am with the Horning Family Foundation. We are a DC-based family foundation, primarily focused on education, and most of our grant making is focused on Ward 8, which is located in Southeast Washington, DC. And I would say early on, at the start of the pandemic, there were two organizations in DC, Fair Chance, which is a capacity building nonprofit, and also the Center for Nonprofit Advancement here in DC conducted surveys of their members of their organizations to really get an understanding of how the pandemic was impacting the organization, both staff related, programmatically, and financially. And some of what we heard from that, which helped to inform the philanthropic community, that there was an increased demand for service, but we knew that organizations knew that revenue was dropping. The financial cost to technology infrastructure and capacity to shift everything to remote, and then to train managers to how do you manage a remote work staff. I know, Louis, you brought up the fee for service. So a lot of our partners work in the schools. And so not so much so for the end of the spring of 2020, but thinking about fall 2020, like what did that look like for partners who were inside of the school? And also a number of the organizations aligned with the data that we just saw talked about this decrease in volunteers. And so we know that a number of organizations rely heavily on volunteers to help to continue the support of their programming. And so that information really helped the philanthropic community to respond. And so a lot of the foundations and donors in the area and in the region were able to do wave funding. So we did the critical emergency funding in the beginning, but then also thinking about how can we support organizations for another year. So I know specifically our foundation, we went on and awarded funding for the following year, and we had not done that before. We advocated with nonprofits to other funders, so hey, let's get started on the general operating, because this is what's going to be needed as nonprofits had to weather the impact of the pandemic, which we did not know how long this was going to last. And so I think the impact, we're still seeing it. We're still trying to figure out what is that going to, how is that ultimately going to impact the nonprofit sector? I mean, that question is still on the minds of individuals. When I talk to a number of our nonprofit partners, the data point around the necessity for individual donors, that was a major concern. Because you think about nonprofits, they were doing a lot of their spring fundraisers where they attract and they get to engage with individual donors, and those were canceled at a moment's notice. And so there was a real concern of how do we continue to access individual donors, corporate sponsorships, when we're no longer having the event that brought those people to the table with the organizations. And so that was super critical for nonprofits. And then I wanted to just switched a little bit. There was a data point that talked about the decrease in donations for smaller organizations. And I wanted to raise that because more recently, the foundation has really grown its grant making, but with an equity approach. And so really looking at smaller community-based organizations that don't have the access to larger philanthropic dollars or donors, and also looking at organizations that are led by Black people and people of color, because the data is out there that the philanthropic dollars that go towards organizations that are led by people of color, there's a huge disparity there. And so there are two things that the foundation did. We started the Neighbor to Neighbor, which is a participatory grant making program specifically for organizations in Ward 8 that are smaller community-based organizations that rely heavily on volunteers. So this provided them funding, and we are also going to be moving to capacity building support for these organizations. And then the second thing that we did, we just completed our first round of our racial justice initiative, which is a grant making initiative that really focuses on Black-led organizing and advocacy efforts. So we know there's a disparity between organizations that are led by Black people or people of color, but then to even think about the subset of the nonprofit, of the groups that are in the organizing, advocacy, community building space, those dollars are even smaller. And so we decided that, again, through a participatory grant making approach, that we would do a 10-year, $5 million investment specifically into Black-led organizing and advocacy efforts in the DC metro area. And so this data that is presented here, I'm not surprised by it. I'm glad that the work that's happening at our foundation is aligned to it. And I think that this information is going to be important as we continue to make decisions as a foundation. So year over year, to have this longitudinal study is going to help not only nonprofits, but I think nonprofits, foundations, policymakers, decision makers, in how we support the nonprofit, and I'll say the nonprofit ecosystem.
Thank you, Dara. I think that was an excellent example of putting data to use. So thank you for that. And I have a couple of follow-up questions, but I want to make sure we also hear from our other great panelists. And Kelly, I'm going to ask you to go next. And Dara raised the data point around small nonprofits serving communities of color. And I know your organization has a lot of those organizations in your network. So I'm curious, what was your reaction to the data when you read it, and how did it resonate with what was happening on the ground in Michigan?
Yeah, thank you very much. The Michigan Nonprofit Association is a statewide association serving nonprofits all over the state. We are membership based. We also do a couple other projects in the civic engagement space, as well as in our public policy and our public affairs areas, in addition to providing some capacity building support to nonprofits. And part of what we also have done is taken a look at data. Data for us has been so critical and key, in particular when we're working with other sectors, including government, right? So when we think about the ability to have this data set that we're talking about here, as well as other data that, organizations like M&A and others are collecting, it's so critically important, because we have found that it is a way to articulate that the sector or the ecosystem is an economic engine in and of itself. And a lot of people don't think about our work in that space. Government, for-profit, sometimes it's still fuzzy. What is it that nonprofits actually do, right? And so in our work in serving nonprofits that are on the ground doing the work, data is so critically important for us to be able to tell that story, because that story around the economic data, like 1 in 10 jobs in Michigan are connected to the nonprofit sector. That kind of opens the door to then be able to talk about the impact stories that nonprofits are having and the way that they're delivering mission. So I also commend and echo what's been said here around just being able to have data sets that tell the story of the sector, that then give us the ability to have the entry point to get into more, what is the story on the ground? And grassroots organizations are absolutely critical to that, to kind of what's been said here. And then Allison, your question as well. I mean, our membership base at M&A, 60 to 70% of those that we serve are the small nonprofit organizations. And we are interested in collecting leadership data on that body and that group of nonprofits even more, because we really want to understand who they are, where they're serving, similar to the data that's been shared here. But I can't emphasize enough how critical the data has been for the association to be able to even just help people understand what is this nonprofit sector and what is it that we do, especially to those that aren't eating and breathing our language, right? Like we have our own lingo of how we talk about things. And I think data helps open up the door for that. Our Michigan data mirrors very similar what we've shared here and what we've talked about here as well. We also, when COVID and the pandemic started, one of the first things we did was reached out to our members to get information on how they were feeling, where they were at, so that we could figure out how to respond. And that information was very helpful for us in the very beginning, because we were able to respond in a couple different ways. One, we were able to put out some capacity building webinars. We were able to interpret executive orders that were coming from state government to really think about how those that were going to remain open continue to remain safe and continue to be able to think about how they were going to execute their bodies of work under those executive orders that were coming out pretty much like by the hour. It felt like in those beginning days. But also one thing that was mentioned in the data, it was how nonprofits were accessing resources like the Paycheck Protection Program, which by the way was historic for nonprofits. I mean, through our advocacy efforts in Michigan, we advocated to say, you know, the application, because the program wasn't designed for nonprofits, the application didn't even include a question on how to check the box for a 501c3 or how to help educate those that were providing the capital to understand that the way that a nonprofit is built and designed, while yes, a small business, our tax structure is different. And the way that we function with our boards is so different. So there was like this whole learning curve of things that had to happen in that space. And I'm hopeful that what an opportunity like a Paycheck Protection Program and the data that we have here does is that it creates a pathway for future opportunity for capital for nonprofits. And I think that's important when we think about the equitable piece that Dara mentioned, with regard to ensuring that all nonprofits, including our grassroots organizations, where access is an issue, that we are not only thinking about access, but we're thinking about a pathway towards capital, period, right? And the Paycheck Protection Program in 2020 was a huge lifesaver in Michigan. We know that. We had nonprofits helping to inform that. We actually set up some technical assistance to help nonprofits navigate and successfully just complete the application. So there was a lot of information that I think has been learned through that process of PPP, but that's just one way that data, information, being able to tell the impact, the economic impact of nonprofits, I think paved a quick path, fortunately, to have access to things like the EIDL loans, the PPP loans, and how wonderful is it that it's, for many of our nonprofits, they're forgiven. Because there is such a myth out there that nonprofits can't access debt. They can't take on loans. Like what? Like, no, we fundraise. No, we do these other things. Like now you're telling me to go get a loan. That feels like that's opposite of what I've been trained and taught to do. And what was interesting too is there's education that happened with the foundation community to say that that was going to be okay, that this was actually a tool in the toolbox to help, and in some ways lessen the load that the philanthropic sector would have to take on, right? So data and things like this allow for those dynamic conversations to happen, to say maybe it's not just the donors who are strapped themselves, and the data was telling us that, and that supported that in Michigan. And it's not just philanthropy, which is often where we look to help provide resources. But here's a pathway where nonprofits can benefit in the midst of a pandemic, just like the small business community was as well. And so I thought that was really important. I think the other kind of critical piece that we're monitoring in response to this also is jobs, right? So our data told us that their nonprofits made pivots. nonprofits saw increases in demand, and some nonprofits had to let people go, right? So the data point around reducing your overhead and your expenses, the largest expense nonprofits have is certainly in our human capital. And so we saw that happen in Michigan as well. And we're monitoring, and I know independent sector is doing a great job in this space too, Allison, of really taking a look at what's going to be the impact on jobs and those that had to leave the workforce. They were either forced to leave the workforce because of reductions, or they were forced to leave the workforce because they had to stay home and take care of their families. And when you look at the statistics here around how many women lead in the nonprofit sector, we know in particular our women were hit hard in that. And so this ability to have longitudinal data like we do will give us the ability, especially at the association, to speak to what is the long-term impacts that the pandemic has had on jobs, on the economy of, the economy within the nonprofit sector. We are often asked, will nonprofits weather this storm? Will we see nonprofits shut down? Will we see nonprofits merge? And I agree with some of what my fellow panel members have said here as well, which is time will tell. But how we all operate in the nonprofit sector and in the ecosystem has definitely changed. And I'm excited to have data like this out there so that, similar to what we saw happen with the Paycheck Protection Program example that I gave, where we're all working together to benefit the nonprofits, that's what excites me most about the data sets like this.
Thank you, Kelly. Something that you reminded me of in this moment, talking about programs like the Paycheck Protection Program. It was sort of the first of its kind for nonprofits. It was adapted from a for-profit program. By research like this collecting data on who was able to take advantage of it and who was not, it is almost like a real-time program evaluation that we can then use to inform the next conversation that we have with policymakers about how to design support for nonprofits that is tailored to their needs and makes it as accessible as possible for those groups that weren't able to take advantage of it. Why were they not? And what can we do next time to maybe boost their accessibility to these types of resources is fantastic way to use this data. Last but not least, Sunil, you have an example of a population in terms of the arts that was particularly hard hit seeing this data. So I want to get a better understanding of what you saw in terms of the arts data that resonated and how that may be carrying forward into 2021 and 2022.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Well, let me begin by applauding, as everyone else has been, the research infrastructure that underlies the study we're discussing today, the nonprofit panel dataset project. It's certainly shaping up to be a longitudinal data source that arts and cultural researchers will be able to consult to answer, I hope, sector-specific questions more and more in the years to come. I also want to note that one of the co-authors, Murray Kim, now at George Mason University, is the past principal investigator on a research grant, NEA research grant. So I've been pleased to watch her work progress and gather momentum over time, and her willingness to share not only her own findings, but her data with other researchers. I'll give you a couple of minutes on background. As was mentioned, I'm the Director of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for the Arts, federal agency. Part of my role in that capacity is overseeing the design and collection of data for the purpose of analysis and reporting about the arts sector at large. We conduct periodic surveys of arts participation in this country with the U.S. Census Bureau. We acquire special tabulations of Bureau of Labor Statistics data so we can report data on artists and jobs in the workforce. We partner with the Bureau of Economic Analysis to understand the economic contributions of arts industries and variables such as employment and compensation of workers within those industries. And we also retain a free public online data repository, the National Archive of Data on Arts and Culture, which I'd encourage some of you to explore. We also finally offer research grant opportunities to investigators who propose to study the value and impact of the arts in American life. So given all those investments, I have to confess that we do not at the present time have an optimal way of tracking vital statistics for nonprofit arts organizations in particular, apart from our occasional foray into IRS data sets, from Form 990 or 990 EZ filers, which many of you know about. So I was more than gratified to see that this new report and this data source beneath it tackles many questions that some of us have been trying to address through other means for many years. Now, more recently, of course, questions specifically about the financial impacts of COVID-19 for arts organizations of various sizes. So, we produced a report last year or earlier this year as sort of an interim report based on surveys we conducted and interviews with the field about sort of proper strategies for reopening. And we just kind of digested, we worked with FEMA and Argonne National Laboratory to produce a white paper on the arts, the impact to the arts sector of COVID-19. But those were kind of snapshots. I think particularly this issue around size is, I think, important. There's different sizes of arts organizations, and that's something, of course, the report goes into. So I'm going to be doing a blog, I think tomorrow, for the Arts Journal website and for the NEA website, and I hope to raise some of these issues. So I want to just note that in the first few months of the pandemic, I'd often heard speculation about, and a lot of us were talking about the extent to which shutdowns, event cancellations, social distancing, the reluctance to travel, how all that would affect the finances of differently sized arts organizations. So, some contended that only the largest organizations, with the steady endowments, loyal patron lists would power through. Others pointed to the inflexible cost structures of those organizations and argued that smaller and more nimbler entities would recover faster over the time. And I think the verdict's still out in a lot of that. However, now we of course have some great some great leads that have been put down here by the report. And I think we still need better and more comprehensive data. And over time, I'm sure this survey will help to acquire it, to understand factors predisposing some arts organizations versus others to survive and even thrive amid exogenous shocks such as COVID-19. So for now, just to point out a few of the things in the report that really jumped out, and I think jumped out not only because they were interesting, but literally hit me on the head because they were so dire in some ways. According to the survey results, 54% of all arts nonprofits reported losses in total revenue in 2020, compared with 36% of all other types of nonprofit. And both in terms of contributed and earned income, arts nonprofits showed sharper declines in 2020 than did other nonprofit organizations, compared with that period that Lewis was talking about, the period of 2015 to 19, when 13% of arts nonprofits reported declines in overall donations. 43% did so in 2020. And losses from fee-for-service income sources, meanwhile, were the greatest for arts organizations than for other nonprofits. In 2020, the median arts nonprofit posted a 50% loss in fee-for-service income. So in contrast to other sectors, the smallest arts nonprofit organizations were among the most likely to report decreases in donations, as you've seen. 57% of arts nonprofits with budgets below $100,000 reported decreases, compared with 27% of arts nonprofits with budgets of $1 million or above. And there was pretty widely distributed across these different income categories. That is to say, the loss to donations. Ultimately, the largest nonprofits within any sector except education, as was pointed out, were the least likely to have experienced declines in donations. Across all sector, arts nonprofits in 2020 were the most likely to have seen donations increase, the largest ones. 65% of arts nonprofits with budgets of at least $1 million fell into this category, which was the greatest share of organizations by budget size within any sector. So I think what this translates to us for the near term are, what are underlying reasons for these disparities? And how do these trends overlap with what we know already through the survey and other sources about the racial, ethnic composition and leadership of these groups, their urban and rural status, or their mix of contributed to earned incomes? And I think that's important too, the relative mix of those sources of income and some of the other financing strategies, Lewis, that you shared. One thing I just have to also give kudos to is the way the study looks at, and I think this is really important in the arts, looks at service areas in addition to headquarters where these organizations are located, as a way of getting a read on the locality around those organizations, as a way of understanding demographics and geographic data. Our agency, for example, when we award grants, we track not only where the grant went, but where did the project activities that were conducted through the grant went. Because you can imagine, a city, an arts organization may be in an urban core area, but they may have a lot of programming in rural areas. So all these factors, I think we need to understand kind of the interrelationships, and what are sort of propensities that we can understand for thriving, as I said, or succeeding, or at least avoiding more dire financial the issues. So I think there's some predictive modeling that could probably be done with some of these data, the more robust we get in terms of the variables and how we relate, the strength of the relationships to these variables. I also want to flag that in the report, it makes some statements about the declines in giving and the possible association with concurrent declines in volunteering, and the long-term trend that is in this country, perhaps, of a decline in volunteering. And I think this is a central question for us as we seek to advance arts participation in the US, since volunteering is so much a big part of how people participate in the arts across diverse subgroups. So those are just some sort of, inklings of where I think future inquiries can go in really creating, I hope, down the road, some statistical modeling that will serve maybe for predictive analytics, so that we can use this maybe as a rapid surveillance system, and not only to drop a report every year, but to actually have hypothesis-driven research questions that can be fueled by this study. And so I just want to advertise the NEA does fund research grants, and I see a couple of grantees on the participant list already. So keep those applications coming. Thanks.
Thank you, Sunil. One of the things that strikes me about what you said, which I think is a great feature of this research going forward, is a lot of times the studies about the sector look just at giving, or they look just at volunteering, or just at earned income and just at service provision, and they don't ask enough questions to understand where there may be intersectionality across these variables, to understand maybe some of the nuances that are happening within nonprofit operations. So it's great to kind of see all that data captured from the same organizations to come up with some of these hypotheses and hopefully eventually some predictive modeling. I want to encourage folks who have not already done so. We're going to turn to a quick Q&A portion, and we do have a couple of questions in the queue already. The first one, I'm going to ask the question and then kind of elaborate on it and add my own additional context for the panelists. So the question asks, a lot of the organizations that spoke talk about building capacity for nonprofit organizations. And they ask, do your organizations or do you know of others that provide support for nonprofit startups or those who are looking to create nonprofits is a question. And then similarly, I'm going to add to that, to what extent do you see data in this study that may give insight on sort of like how well startups fared in the last, well, actually not just the pandemic, but before and during the pandemic, in terms of financial service provision, et cetera. So I'm going to stop and allow our panelists, and including you, Louis, to respond if you like.
Thank you, Allison. Dara, do you want to respond? Especially, this question was asking how organizations like the Horning Family Foundation are responding to this funding issue.
Yeah, so I would say we primarily in the past, we partner with Fair Chance, the group that I mentioned earlier around this, they did a lot of the survey. They do a lot of work with capacity building around newer organizations and more established organizations that just need additional support. So that would be, if you are in the DC area, and I think they're also in Prince George's County, Maryland. If you're in those areas, that would be an organization to look into. We're a very small foundation, and so we are just now starting with capacity building, specifically around our Neighbor to Neighbor initiative, because that is focused on smaller community-based organizations within Ward 8. And we, at the end of our grant making round, we survey those who are awarded grants and those who are not. And so what we keep hearing that's coming up around capacity building for the smaller organizations, our fundraising comes top every time. And that is not just in engaging individual donors, but also like, how do I, even as simple as how do I write an application, a grant application? How can you help me to develop standard messaging, communication that I can share to tell the story of the work that we're doing within the organization? Another piece that continues to come up similar to communication is like the online presence. It is difficult for an organization that does not have a web presence during this time where everyone is clicking on a phone, on a tablet, on a computer, that is the fastest way to access organizations. So actually building up the communication, the technology support for organizations. So we are just getting started in that, and starting with specifically the smaller, these are very, very grassroots organizations in the Ward A community. But I will say Fair Chance, and there are other funders in the region that do specifically focus on capacity building. That it just varies from foundation to foundation. That has not just been our wheelhouse and our area of expertise. That is something we're starting in now, but I know that there are other foundations in the area that specifically support capacity building efforts, both for newer organizations and also those that have been around for some time.
Yeah, and I'm happy to add on, Allison. So the Michigan Nonprofit Association, we are not in direct service delivery in Michigan, but we work with a network of intermediary organizations who they themselves are nonprofit organizations designed to support other nonprofits in the capacity building space, including startups. And they do everything from how do you bring an organization online to how do you dissolve an organization, because there's a whole process to doing that and everything in between. So within Michigan, there's a network that we can certainly get you connected to. But of course, as a state association, we're connected to other state associations. So that's another great place to start, because there may be networks within your own state of which your state association might be a part of or is aware of, whether it could be in a major city and there's an organization like Fair Change serving a major city, and community, versus like in Michigan, there's 13 different capacity building organizations or intermediaries that we work with across the state, and they're kind of geographically positioned. Then there's also organizations that work with particular subsectors. We work with intermediary organizations that only serve the arts and culture community, and they are membership based. So there's a couple different ways that I think you could access capacity building services within your own state, depending on how your network works in your state. Foundations that have been mentioned here, there are more and more foundations that are establishing funds specific to startups or the smaller size organizations, as Dara has mentioned. So certainly the foundation community is one. But one thing that I think is interesting to think about too is, if you're thinking of the startup space, sometimes, and what we've seen in Michigan in particular, is the ability to designate a fiduciary or a fiscal sponsor for your work. And that is something that I'm curious to see if that will be a trend post the pandemic as well, where maybe an organization is better equipped to do the mission work of the organization and doesn't need to get bogged down in the operational, aspect of running a nonprofit and paying people. And so is there organizations that you can partner with that do that really well and can be that backbone for you, that then actually allow for that mission work to take place? And then it could be that new entities aren't formed, but new ways of collaborating and partnering are in that space. And so that's something that we're kind of interested in exploring as well. But there's a whole network. And certainly if you want to reach out to me directly, I'd be happy to get you pointed in the right direction of wherever you are geographically in the network that I'm aware of across the country around capacity building.
Keisha, I just want to thank you for that question. And it's related to Heather McIndoe's question as well on the sizes of organizations we're looking at. And I want to highlight here that this is our first year and first panel through this project, but it is a broad collaborative initiative. And we do have other panels, including a supplemental panel of startup organizations that we'll be surveying starting this next year. So just to highlight some of the utility of this broader collaborative project. And to welcome other collaborators and interests in different questions and different panels along the way as well.
Louis, I know we're getting close to time. There was, and there are more questions than we have time to answer. There was a question about impact that I thought was important of, did this research measure impact, which is kind of ending important question when it comes to measuring data around nonprofits, and always really difficult. So I'm going to lob that at you for a very quick response as we start to close out the program.
Yes, thank you, Allison. And this again, we included a lot of questions in the survey, which we encourage everyone to explore through the public use data file, which I linked in the chat. And there are a lot of questions that could get at some of these questions of impact or efficiency that extend beyond financials. So for instance, the number of people served, the types of programs that organizations offer. This will become a lot more useful as we gather data over time. So when we're able to compare the year 1 results to year 2, year 3, year 4, and track the same organizations, it'll give us a lot more power in terms of being able to analyze even relatively simple statistics on, for instance, number of people served, to understand how those change over time relative to impacts or environmental changes like the pandemic. But again, I welcome collaborators. I see a number of people, fantastic scholars on the call. Just anyone who has an interest in questions that could be fielded or panels that you would like to discuss, then this is a broad collaborative initiative that we'd like to engage as many of the research community and practitioner community in that as possible.
Great. I know we're running a little over time, and even some of the panelists have a hard stop. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I assume, Louis, if folks didn't get their questions answered, they would be able to follow up with you and other members of the research team to get additional information, because there's a lot of information to share, and there were some really good questions we didn't get to. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Allison, and thank you to the panel and for everyone who is joining us today. Now that we're getting to the end of the hour, I wish we had 3 more, but I do look forward to continuing to discuss not only these first-year findings, but also findings and other elements of the project as it unfolds. So please do keep in touch. I've put my email in the chat. Please do follow up with an email to me, and I can also put you in touch with our other collaborators and other and panelists as well. But thank you, everyone. Thank you to the AU SBA events team for helping put this together. And thank you again to our funders, the Generosity Commission and National Science Foundation, in addition to independent sector and other funders along the way. So Allison, thanks. Kelly, Sunil, and Dara, thanks so much for joining us. And thanks to Sheena Ashley for joining us as well. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and please keep in touch.